National Museum of Ireland, Archaeology has a huge collection of objects from our past. But why are these so important? In this film, we look at the arrival of Christianity in Ireland and show how these objects can tell us about the impact Christianity had on the people who lived here and the changes it brought to Ireland.
There are many different religions in Ireland today, and there were many different religions in the past, and we know this from objects like this one. And this has three faces. It's a three-faced Celtic god. It's associated with the Celtic god Lugh, and it comes from Corlack in County Cavan. This is the time, I suppose, that we would associate with the Celts.
Yeah, and of course, this is around the time when the great stories around ancient Irish heroes like Cuchulainn were based, which are often centred in ancient Irish sites like Owen Macha.
And the Loch Nishade trumpet was discovered nearby, not far from Navan Fort at Loch Nishade, or the Lake of the Treasures. Many objects were found at that ceremonial site.
Yeah, with the really distinctive artwork on the bottom of it. And then a little bit later, you have the Romans. And of course, the Romans never invaded Ireland, but we have evidence for contact from the earliest stage. And then in the 4th to 5th century, we see things like the Boleyn hoard, which are chopped up bits of silver plate, which were being paid probably by Roman Britons to Irish kings to stop them raiding parts of their shoreline. And we know at this time then they're coming into contact with the early Christians, and early Christian people are then travelling to Ireland.
So it's like if you saw your sister in your jumper, you'd know, she's been in my bedroom and borrowed it. And it's the same thing with the evidence of the Roman hoards here. We know there was contact between Ireland and the Romans by the objects that we find here.
Exactly, that's kind of like, that's what the role of the archaeologist or the historian is. It's like a detective piecing things together. And you can see that kind of continuation in borrowing then. As you mentioned, the designs on the horn are very like the designs on a stone from Mullamast in County Kildare, which comes from the 6th century and isn't that far from Glendalough.
And Christianity had a huge impact on Ireland and the lives of people here. And you can see that through the different objects that we have here in the museum. So we're going to take a look now and see how life changed for people in Ireland because of Christianity.
The objects from the Glendalough exhibition hold many clues and evidence of the arrival of Christianity in Ireland. Each object from this famous Christian site is a piece of a puzzle, which, when we look at it all together, can tell us about the people alive at the time, what they believed and how they lived.
So, what can a piece of burnt wood and an early Christian handbell tell us about the buildings and the valley of Glendalough 1,500 years ago? We all know St. Patrick and St. Bridget, but Glendalough had its own saint, St. Kevin. According to the early Irish annals, he was born in Leinster and died in 618 AD. He was buried here in the valley, and his grave became a very famous place of pilgrimage.
The old Irish annals tell us that St. Kevin brought Christianity to this area. He left a monastery near Tallaght in Dublin, went into the wilds of the Glendalough Valley, and started what would become a powerful and famous monastery. As the centuries passed, the annals had more and more elaborate tales of what he did, banishing monsters, carrying hot coals without being burnt, and even turning cheese into stone.
These myths and legends sound very, very interesting, but when were they written down?
Well, most of the stories about St. Kevin weren't written down till about at least 300 years after he had died. And then they were added to and changed over time. So we can't really be sure exactly which are the earliest stories about him.
Okay, well, what can archaeology tell us then about people who lived here in the time of St. Kevin?
Well, most of the buildings, the church buildings in the valley, they don't date till maybe 500 years after St. Kevin was meant to have died. Mm-hmm. So really the earliest evidence was found actually behind us here at the Cahir, this stone circular monument, where we found a ditch around it, and in that ditch was charcoal.
the same kind of charcoal that you'd use for a barbecue?
Yeah, so burnt wood. And the burnt wood was found along with bits of what's called slag or metalworking waste from making iron. And we know from early Irish laws that they were meant to have a sack of charcoal for making iron. This really early evidence it shows us that a blacksmith was working here at the Cahir at the time of St. Kevin.
So when they were using the charcoal back then, what kind of objects would the blacksmith have made?
Well, the most important object that would have been made at an early monastic site would have been an iron bell. And we have one in our exhibition which was found quite close to Glendalough in a place called Knocker Temple. So the little piece of charcoal that we found in the ditch with the metalworking waste shows that there were people here connected with the working of metal at the time of St. Kevin.
So it really is evidence then that Christianity was in the valley at that time.
Yeah, it's the earliest evidence we have for people here during that time period.
So what can we learn about Christianity and the past from looking at objects? Often, we learn a lot about our past from the artwork on these objects. The early Christian styles combined the earlier Celtic styles with woven strands called interlace, often containing many interwoven beasts and birds and mythical creatures. They were used to decorate books, like the Book of Kells, stone crosses, and also metal objects.
So the most famous is this, the Ardagh chalice. It's a silver cup which was used in the Christian Mass, and it was found in a place near Ardagh in County Limerick by two boys digging for potatoes. It shows a whole range of decorative techniques that were used in early medieval period, early Christian period in the 8th century, including glass, amber, quartz, silver, and gold wire. And the gold wire is threaded for a band of strange creatures with interlocking arms and legs, which depict scenes from the Bible. And this is probably the finest example of early Christian art. Great monasteries like Glendalough accumulated wealth, and they sought to hire craftsmen to make beautiful objects. And we have one of them here today in the case, this beautiful gilt mount, and it's a small piece of metal, beautiful interlaced design, copper alloy, but it's made to look like gold, so it's gilt. And it was part of a horse harness. They would have been working both in metal and in stone. So there's a beautiful cross, also the market cross, which is in another style called Hiberno-Ernest style, so it's a Viking influenced style of art from a little bit later. But this object is from around the same time as the Ardagh chalice.
Okay, and relics, I mean, are the greatest evidence we have of all the artwork that was done, I suppose, in early Christian Ireland. We have the beautiful St. Patrick's Bell Shrine. We even have a shrine of St. Blocton's arm. And a relic is, of course, anything that can be associated with a saint. It can be something they used or wore, or it can be part of their body. And of course, they're enshrined in these beautiful casings of gold and silver and beautiful metalwork. But are there any relics from Glendalough?
Because of a series of events, perhaps things like there were 3 different Viking raids at Glendalough, and then after that, later on in the later medieval period, Glendalough became abandoned, and maybe its relics were put away and taken away from Glendalough. But we know they were there because in 790, we know that the relics were taken on a tour of the territory which Glendalough, the monastery, controlled. But the closest thing that we have from Glendalough that is an actual artefact of evidence of what might have been there is probably this plaster cast that we can see here. So it's a cast made of a stone that's in Glendalough over a doorway. And what it shows is an abbot, and then it's got a bishop on the other side who both would have been living at Glendalough. And they're holding 2 objects. The abbot is holding a handbell, which we've seen already, so a really old sign of the church's power. And the bishop is holding a crozier, which is kind of a crooked staff covered in all kinds of beautiful ornament. And we have many of them here in the museum. Neither of these objects survive for Glendalough, but we have references to them and we know that they were there.
It's really hard to make that out on the stone, Matt. I mean, were there other ways that the site was recorded? Because I suppose the weather has worn away the stone an awful lot.
Well, what we're very lucky is that from the 18th century onwards, artists were going to Glendalough and they were recording the details on the stonework. So before this stone was broken, someone else recorded the complete stone. Someone then recorded it again in the 19th century and again at the end of the 19th century. So using those and the plaster cast, we can piece together what this stone looked like. And we think it might have been over the building that was used to contain the relics, a place called the Priest's House in Glendalough.
These days, Glendalough is really popular with hikers and ramblers. They might come here for a 2 or 3 hour walk around the lakes and the mountain ridges. The pilgrims, however, it might have taken them 2 to 3 weeks to get here. And the early Irish annals tell us that Glendalough was at least a 1 day's walk from civilization.
So, who was coming and why were they coming? Many different people came here. Some were very religious and came from far away and would have travelled across the sea to get here. Others may have been seeking refuge or to connect with God. We know this from some objects we have found at Glendalough.
This cross was discovered during recent excavations in the valley of Glendalough. It's made of a material called jet, and jet is found in Whitby in England. So it might have been worn by a monk who's maybe coming on pilgrimage to the valley. But I think you said others were coming to Glendalough as well.
So apart from priests, bishops, abbots and nuns, you would also, there's evidence in historical sources for quite important people, local and regional kings who were coming to stay at Glendalough, probably making up for the lives they'd led, maybe of violence, and looking for forgiveness for their sins in their final years at Glendalough. There are other objects then in the exhibition which kind of illustrate how far people might have come and the objects that came with them. And one in particular, beside the jet cross, is a piece of a tile made out of a stone called porphyry. So porphyry comes from the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's used in Roman buildings. And we know that in Rome now, you had the Pope, and his authority extended throughout Europe. And in Northern Europe, bits of these stone tiles were seen to have been given to maybe missionaries, and those missionaries then were sent out all over Europe to different places. And we find them in Ireland in some quite remote places, including right up on this rock at Temple na Skellig, in this house where we found this piece of tile.
So during early Christian times, people were beginning to go on pilgrimages to many places, some long distances, but some maybe short as well. And we also have a shoe from the valley from Lugduff. We think from the size of the shoe, from looking at it, that it might have been worn by a woman. It's only a size 4. And we think there were many women coming to the valley as well.
That's right, and unfortunately the written sources for women at Glendalough are quite poor, but obviously this object shows that women were here. And we know that there were also powerful women here, because we know that the mother of a high king was actually went into retirement in Glendalough, probably in St Mary's or Our Lady's Church, which was a place where nuns lived.
And apart from coming to pray, there were other reasons that people were coming to Glendalough.
Well, some people would have actually been coming to Glendalough to seek safety or sanctuary. Glendalough would have been surrounded by a big ditch or moat, and it would have had a gatehouse. And once you were within that, you were safe from the law of outside. And we know from a lot later, in the late medieval period, that a man who murdered his son was sent on a tour of the most holy places in Ireland to do penance for his sins. And one of those places was St Kevin's Bed in Glendalough. Unlike today, people in the medieval period would have rarely left their home place. So when they wanted to journey to monasteries like Glendalough, they would have followed stone crosses like these. Two important examples are in the National Museum. One, called the Labyrinth Stone, has a network of passages which look like a maze. The other one we have is a concrete cast of a cross which stood on St. Kevin's Way. The cross on this cast is very unusual and looks exactly like the one on a pin which was found at Temple na Skellig behind us here in an excavation in the 1950s. All these objects, the jet cross, the shoe, the tile, and the stone crosses, show us that medieval Christians came to the valley from near and far.
There were lots of hungry pilgrims then coming over the mountains looking to be fed, and there was no McDonald's back then, so we need another way of feeding them, I suppose the monasteries did. And the biggest object that we have in the exhibition, and it of course tells us about the food they ate, is this beautiful cauldron, and it is quite a spectacular cauldron. I know it's from later on in the time of the valley, but something like this would have been used to feed all the pilgrims, the monks, the priests who were there. But what kind of food would they have ate?
So this kind of vessel would be used to make something called pottage, which is kind of a mixture of grain, something like stock, and then maybe, if they were lucky, bits of meat and vegetables mixed in. So a kind of a stew, and it's a typical diet in the later medieval period.
And I suppose the ingredients for this stew, we have evidence for that as well. I think we have some grains here.
Yeah, so we've both oat and barley in the exhibition, some charred oat and barley, which would have come from the excavations. We've also evidence for a millstone at the site. So a milling is something that came in with Christian monasteries, and mills were used to produce grain, flour, and render cereal.
Okay, and it wasn't just food, there's also drink, of course, in the valley, and we have some pottery here, some very expensive pottery that would have been imported.
This jug comes from Bristol, and it's a ceramic jug, and it would have been used to serve wine or potentially water.
Okay, it's very pretty, and I suppose we have this in the handling collection in the museum. I think it's, around the same time period, the same handle on it, but yeah. Would it have been something like this?
Something like that, except it shows a hunting scene, so it's got just the edge of someone's hand holding a big long wooden club. They might have been blowing a horn and chasing something, a stag or something like that, on the original pot before it broke.
So we're getting lots of evidence then around food in the valley, but what do you think about early Christianity then in food? What's the big change?
Well, we know that the whole idea of the monastery, the early stories of St. Kevin talk about how he went into a wild place and made it really fertile, so that cows were well fed, cereals grew. So the idea of a monastery was that it was provisioned that people were bringing food to it from outside, from the other churches. The introduction of Christianity meant that monasteries completely changed the way that food production was organised in Ireland.
By the 8th century, Glendalough was getting busy, not just with the pilgrims walking here, but also with the dead. It was called the Cemetery of the Western World in 780 AD, and it was said that its graveyard was getting really crowded.
So what can we learn from how people are buried? Well, by looking at gravestones around us here and the valley, we can see that people have been buried here for over 1,000 years. And they're still buried here today. With the arrival of Christianity, how people were buried changed. We see the burial of an individual, and we see the burial of the body so that they're facing east-west. They're going to face Jerusalem. If you were rich enough, you might get a gravestone, marking where they were buried, with their names carved on it, so that they would be remembered. Further up the valley, there's a church, and really important people would have been buried up there. It's associated with regional kings and queens. Ordinary people might have been buried with no marker, but we can still see graves all around us today, and we still have that practice of having our names inscribed on the gravestones. With the arrival of Christianity, we see a gradual changing in writing styles as well. This stone behind me is over 1,500 years old, and on it we see Ogham or own writing. And that style of writing is very Irish and is used for writing Irish family names. But with Christianity, we see a move on manuscripts, but also on those gravestones, and it can be seen here on this stone as well to the Roman or Latin alphabet. So in Glendalough, we actually have over 100 of those gravestones from that early Christian period, requesting prayers to be said, and the gravestones have on them, in that Latin writing, the names of the people who died.
So, like today, a bell would have been rung when someone was being buried. In the beginning, this was a handbell, like we saw in the exhibition. But as bells changed, so did the design of the buildings. The earliest churches at Glendalough would have been wooden, but over time they were replaced by stone churches, and there are 7 of them still surviving in Glendalough. You might notice the small circular tower at the back of this church. This was used to carry a suspended bell. There is also a bigger freestanding tower called a round tower, or in Irish, cligteach, which means bell house, but we're not sure what kind of bell was rung in it. The suspended bell that we have in the exhibition is made of copper alloy, and it would have been bought from somewhere in northwestern Europe to be suspended in this bell tower. It would have been bought at great expense, probably through the port of Dublin, sometime in the 11th century. And it would have been rung continuously during funeral services here at Glendalough. Today, when we're at a loose end, we play games on our phone, or maybe a board game. This is a modern version of Nine Men's Morris, a game that's been around for over 1200 years. A stone found at Glendalough with scratch markings on it was probably a version of this game. Board games are found at a lot of monastic sites, and they were a sign of a good education.
Sorry, The Glendalough board game was probably scratched quite quickly into the stone by 2 monks who were trying to pass the time. We know that monks did play board games, and we have found board games at archaeological sites in Ireland, and also small little gaming pieces of wood and bone. One of the places that we've also found a board game is down in County Kerry at the Scarlegs, also a monastic site. And it was one of the locations for the Star Wars films. But what other evidence do we have for education and learning at Glendalough? Well, as a young monk, you would have had to learn Latin, Greek, Hebrew, maths and philosophy, and to write. You also would have been looked up to if you had a lot of knowledge. They were called lectors. We know that books were written at Glendalough because there's a book of complex maths, and there's a little note in that book that records an abbot dying in Glendalough. You also, as a monk, would have had to practice your writing before you started writing any manuscripts, and you would have used something like this, a little wax tablet.
As well as people coming here to learn, they also came here for power. The church and saints had a new wealth and influence over the population, and that wasn't to everyone's liking.
The site of Glendalough then is becoming more powerful, more wealthy, and that attracts other types of power. I suppose the regional kings and even queens were interested in what was happening there within the site. We know even some of the families fought over the site of Glendalough. They would have wanted family members maybe to be an abbot, or they might have wanted one of the powerful women in the family might become a widow and she might retire to Glendalough. And it was all about having a connection to this place that was seen as a place of power.
So, I mean, this pin that you can see in front of you here, with the round head and the beautiful decorated cross on it. This probably belonged to a bishop and was part of their pall, which was a garment given to them as a sign of their office. So a piece of clothing put around their neck and fastened with these beautiful pins. And this one dates to the 11th century. One of the most significant people associated that might have worn this kind of pin was a famous abbot called Lawrence O'Toole, who later became a saint. And in the beginning, he was Abbot of Glendalough. He was eventually promoted to become Archbishop of Dublin. But we know that he came back to this little remote ledge at the upper lake in Glendalough, and he prayed in the cave there, which is called St. Kevin's Bed. He's probably the most famous person who we know of other than St. Kevin associated with Glendalough. And his heart is actually kept in Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin, which you can still see today. And I guess this is a sign of the growing power of Dublin.
As we saw earlier with the gilt horse mount, Vikings came to Glendalough from early on. They would have first come to plunder the wealth and people, but as the Vikings began to settle in Ireland and Glendalough became more powerful, they began to trade with each other.
We know this from 3 hoards of coins that have been found at Glendalough. So there was a lot of trading and connections going on between the monastic site and then the Viking city of Dublin.
Yeah, so one of the most exciting objects that we have here in the exhibition is this silver coin, which is a penny of King Sitric, who was the Viking king of Dublin. And it's the first Irish coinage, first coin to be minted in Ireland. And what's interesting about it is it actually has a cross on it. So it's an imitation of a coin used at the same time in England, but it's giving across that message that Christianity is now part of the trading system. And coins like this would be used in everyday transactions in Glendalough.
And then, of course, the people in Glendalough were also selling things to the Vikings. And we have one of the most unusual examples of this that comes from Denmark, the home of the Vikings. And the reason we have this evidence is it's ship's timbers, the timbers of a ship, and the wood came from the monastic site of Glendalough, but would have been traded to the Vikings and then would have been used by them to make a ship that was sailed to Denmark. And we have such good evidence about that ship that they recreated one. They made a replica, which is called the Sea Stallion from Glendalough.
Then, of course, after that time, the Vikings gradually became a part of local politics, and they became allied with local kings, and they were used to fight one side against another. And Dublin became an increasingly important town. And gradually there was a fight over which centre would become the ruling part of the church. And eventually Dublin won out in a kind of a Game of Thrones.
So I suppose Glendalough becomes a rebel, it becomes called a den of thieves and robbers.
That's right, and that's what one bishop said about Glendalough. But of course that was kind of fake news, because we know from archaeological evidence, from things that you've seen already, the cauldron, the pot, a coin hoard, all of these things are showing us that Glendalough was very much alive even after the bishop was no longer sitting there anymore.
Today, the valley is famous as a national park, and people from all over the world visit to see the scenery and the 2 beautiful lakes. And all the stories of powerful struggles and of those who lived there in the past are hidden in the valley. We only have the legends of the annals, the remains of the buildings, and a few objects left.
So we've shown how, by looking at these objects, the buildings and the landscape in the valley, that we can understand what happened here in the past.
And thanks to archaeology, how this simple piece of charcoal helps unlock the start of the story of early Christianity here in the monastery at Glendalough.
All exhibitions at the National Museum of Ireland Archaeology contain original objects and artefacts. But how did they come to be exhibited in the museum? And how did we uncover the stories that they can tell us? Each object has gone on a unique journey from discovery to display in the Glendalough exhibition. In this film, we'll see the many ways in which archaeologists find evidence about our past from the objects they discover and the new technologies they use to unlock their secrets. We'll hear the stories of how they were found, what they were used for, and what they can tell us about the people and landscape of Glendalough over the last 1,000 years.
This is one of the star objects in our exhibition at Glendalough, and it's a handbell, and it was found in a valley close to Glendalough in the 1870s by someone who was doing a very early form of archaeological excavation. And these kinds of people were called antiquarians. It was kept in an old collection and then was donated to the National Museum of Ireland by the Archbishop of Dublin. So, what can this handbell tell us about what was going on in Glendalough in the past?
This is a replica early Christian handbell.
Yeah, so this is exactly the kind of bell that would have been used in Glendalough. Of course, we don't have one surviving from Glendalough itself, but we have one in the exhibition that comes from a place called Temple, which is about 10 kilometres away, and was found during an excavation. And we think that that bell was made here in Glendalough. And we know there are bells in Glendalough because they're there in the stories. Stories about saints like Saint Berock, who carried a bell around the ditch of the monastery and he rang it to cast out demons.
So it's a handbell because it was rung by hand. But what kind of a metal was it made out of?
So it's made out of iron, and it's made out of a single sheet of iron. And to make this much iron, you'd need a lot of resources, so it would be very expensive to make an object like this. They are a very, very significant object for Glendalough.
So the bell then wasn't just hidden away somewhere safe. It actually was used the whole time during the day. It would have been a very busy object here, marking the day and calling people to prayers, and then of course for funerals as well.
Yeah, it was a central part of life at the monastery.
And a real symbol that Christianity was here as well.
Absolutely, and they say that the sound of the bell was the limit of the power of the monastery, so how far it could be heard away from the monastery was how big the monastery was.
They were lucky they were in a valley in Glendalough.
Yeah.
It would have rung through the valley. Yeah.
True,
yeah. So later we're going to learn about what making a replica object can teach us. But now we're going to look at what happens to an object when it first comes into the museum. Over the years, many objects have been donated to the museum to take care of on behalf of the Irish people. This means the objects need to be looked after and preserved by specialist scientists, called conservators, and it allows experts in many fields to study them.
So this is an iron bell that I worked on for the Glendalough exhibition, and when it came into us, it was quite badly damaged. When it was discovered in 1873, there was an account of it getting a whack with a pickaxe, which could explain why a lot of it was missing, and it was quite badly damaged. I'm an archaeological conservator, so that involves looking after all of our archaeological collections. Something like leather and metal, when it comes out of the ground, it's gone into a completely different environment from the one in which it was buried. So changes can occur and that cause corrosion or cracking and decay. So we have to make sure that we look after them so that this damage doesn't happen. And when the bell came out of storage and into the conservation laboratory, the first thing I did was check it just to see if any corrosion was taking place. And on iron objects, if it's corroding, you'll see this powdery orange substance that we know is rust, and that's a sign that the bell is corroding because oxygen and water vapour actually cause iron to rust. So thankfully that wasn't happening. This bell is made from iron, but we wouldn't use iron to fix the bell because it's too heavy and we're not able to work with welders and things like that in conservation. So I had to come up with a method that would give the bell enough strength, and which we could also then colour in to make it look like it was part of the bell. So I used a thing called Japanese tissue, which is a paper that's used in conservation. It's very strong paper, and also it's there are no nasty chemicals in it that might harm the bell. So I tore it into strips, and then I adhered these strips to the inside of the bell, kind of from here to here, and maybe from there to there, and just started bridging the gaps in between with the strips. In the front here, all of this is new. I really wanted to restore it to kind of its former glory, to make it look like a bell again, so that when it went on exhibition, the public would come in and they'd see a bell rather than just a piece of old iron. So if you look inside and you can see all of the cream-coloured paper, that's where the pieces were missing, and then that's how I filled it. But a very important thing that we do in museums is we don't want to fool the viewer into thinking that all of this is ancient. So while from a distance it looks like one object, when you get up close, it's supposed to look as if this piece is repaired and this is original, and the viewer should be able to see the difference. It's amazing if you just see an iron object with your eyes, it mightn't look very impressive, but then when you look under a microscope, you might see remains of mineralised organics, like you might see the scabbard on a Viking sword, or textile remains on the back of a brooch. So it's quite exciting actually when you get to see an object up close, and you learn a lot more about the object, and you feel that bit more connected to the person who used to own the object. Yeah.
Whilst most objects are discovered during planned excavations and by archaeologists, some objects are discovered during Sunday afternoon strolls, people out for a walk, and completely by accident.
So this is the archive room in the National Museum of Ireland. All of the objects we've seen have a file connected to them. This is a file relating to a leather shoe that was found in Lugduff townland in Glendalough in 1989 by a hill walker. It was found in some bogland on the side of the mountain. The hill walker reported it. Staff from the National Museum went out to collect the shoe, and collected a whole series of records, which include a map which shows where the finder has marked the location of the shoe, and also all the records then of the shoe after that date. The shoe is made of leather, it's heavily worn, it was probably worn by a woman, and is over 1100 years old. So this is where all the pieces of the jigsaw come together, and we can tell the full story of an object.
So we say that this woman's shoe is at least 1,000 years old. But how do we really know that? For the answer, we have to look to science. Archaeologists work with lots of science laboratories and scientists to discover information about objects. We sent the shoe to Belfast to a carbon dating laboratory, where they were able to work out how old it was.
So this is the only radiocarbon dating lab on the island of Ireland. Radiocarbon dating is a wonderful scientific technique that allows us to date anything that lived once upon a time up to about 50,000 years ago, so as far back as the Ice Age. So archaeologists can come to us with organic material that they've excavated, and what we can do is we can radiocarbon date it.
So we receive the samples in our lab, so that's the piece of leather or the bone or the charcoal, and through a 4-step process we transform it from the sample into a small graphite pellet, which is what goes into the AMS. So we need to load a small amount of this sample into the tube. We need to extract the carbon dioxide gas from it, because it's radiocarbon date, we need the carbon, not the whole sample. And to do this, really simple, you just burn the sample. So we have the carbon dioxide gas, and now we need to turn that into solid graphite. We reduce the carbon dioxide, we remove the oxygen, and that just leaves us with carbon, the graphite powder, just like in your pencil. And then we manually press this into a pellet in an aluminium target, which is loaded onto the sample wheel, which is what is put into the AMS.
So here in 14 Chrono, we use an accelerator mass spectrometer. And that's really important in terms of its ability to filter out all other molecules, all other atoms, and only identify and detect and measure radiocarbon. So the power of radiocarbon is that anything that has lived or existed has and contains radiocarbon. Plants take up carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. Animals eat those plants, so also take up radiocarbon. For example, with the Glendalough shoe, we get in a piece of leather. We're not given any information as to how old this piece of leather is going to be. Now, with radiocarbon, if we know how much is left, we have an estimate of how much radiocarbon there was to begin with. We also know how quickly radiocarbon radioactively decays. So with all of that information, we can provide an estimate of when the organic artifact was last alive. So the leather shoe that we radiocarbon dated dates from the medieval period, so the 10th to 11th century. One type of material that we can analyse is human bone, and we would regularly date bone from all periods, from all parts of the world. And we would be able to go back to an archaeologist or even a police force and tell them whether it's something more recent or something that could be prehistoric and is more of concern to an archaeologist than it is to a policeman. You know, it's fascinating for us too, because we're getting in samples, we're not necessarily told what they are, and we'll give them back to the archaeologist, and then we get the full story and the more interesting story of what actually happened or what the sample actually was.
Another way of finding out about an object is to look at how it was made, to look at the style, which might tell us the date, but also to make a replica, to recreate an object, such as the shoe here.
This is part of a process called experimental archaeology, and in the last 10 years it has given us another way of finding out information about an object.
Well, I suppose the whole idea behind experimental archaeology, which is what I'm trying to work here, is to take the material that an archaeologist finds and then try and deconstruct it in order to find out how it was made. You're learning the tricks that were necessary, and it can sometimes explain little anomalies that can be found in an artifact. What I'm going to try and explain to you here is the process which is involved in trying to make a replica of a 1,000-year-old shoe, such as the Glendalough shoe, which was found near Glendalough. The seam which runs down the front, or the vamp of the shoe, is quite unusual, and it is completely different to the seam at the back, at the heel of the shoe, which is just a very simple series of knife cuts to join the two pieces together. And it may suggest that the shoe was started by an experienced shoemaker and finished by an inexperienced shoemaker. As far as possible, you only use the technology of the period. And to me, that's the fun of experimental archaeology. It has to be very simple, all for piercing holes. It's using wax thread, possibly using a needle, and a very sharp knife, and that's it. Now, on this attempt here, you can see how we have one type of stitch here running up the center of what's called the vamp, running up the front of the shoe. And then at the heel, we have a sequence of 10 slits on both edges, which then are essentially laced together. Interesting one I came across was working on a shoe from an archaeological dig, where you can actually see the imprint of the person's foot in the shoe, right down to the imprint of the big toenail, which was a bit odd. The interesting thing about these shoes is there were no needles used. The sewing medium, in this case artificial sinew, can be twisted until it becomes extremely tight. And it's possible, as I can show you here, to push it through the hole without having to use a needle. And it makes the stitch. But you can see here the way in which when I pull the cord, it pulls the edges together. And it's as near to the original detail as I can manage to get. Shoes were patched and repaired and worn and patched until they were eventually beyond repair. Then they get thrown in the town ditch, and 1,000 years later somebody digs them up. And that's the kind of process that is going on within archaeology and within experimental archaeology as well. As I say, it's the stories that come out of the objects, and it kind of brings the object alive, which I find is quite interesting.
Well, the shoe tells us the story of the woman who travelled a distance to come here on pilgrimage. Other objects tell us other stories about the connections between Glendalough and the wider world. And the clue to that lies in the material that the objects were made out of. In the exhibition, we have this really tiny little object here, the smallest object in the exhibition, which has many hidden stories. Matt, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
So this is a really tiny little jet cross. It's about the size of the top of your fingernail, and it's got a little hole for stringing around your neck. And yeah, it's made from a stone called jet, and it's got these tiny little cup marks in it which are filled with tin. And it was actually found on an excavation in 2018, and it was found by someone who was sieving soil through a sieve, sieving all day long and not finding a whole lot. And then the end of the day, suddenly he saw this glinting in the sieve, picked it up, and it was an amazing find, this 12th century jet cross.
Other objects in the exhibition were only discovered recently as well in the last 2 or 3 years. So it would have looked very different, this exhibition, if it hadn't been for those archaeological excavations. I suppose the other thing about the little cross is it's made of jet, which has a great story behind it, what it's made out of as well, doesn't it?
So to understand the jet cross properly, you have to look at where other jet objects are found in Ireland and elsewhere, and then you also have to look at where do you find jet, where in the world would you find the source of jet. So if we look at this map of Europe, we can see where other jet crosses like the one from Glendalough have been found. We can also see that there are relatively few of them and that they're quite a rare object. You can see that there's quite a concentration of them in the northeast of England in a place called Whitby, and also in York. And Whitby is the source of jet, and it's probable that this material came from there and the crosses were made there and then taken through York along what were the older Viking sea routes to places like Norway, Greenland, and a small number to Ireland, probably through the port of Dublin. So looking at where these jet crosses are found and looking at the kind of material it's made from tell us something about the journey it made to Glendalough in the 12th century with its owner. Of course, when we think of archaeologists, we think of them digging, and many of the objects we've seen, like the jet cross, came from digging a hole in the ground. But it's not as simple as that. Increasingly, many new technologies are used to decide where to dig and what to look for. And they let us see things never possible before. One team of archaeologists using these methods are from the Discovery Programme and UCD. They use geophysical surveys to discover what's beneath the ground, and they also look at it from above using drones. This gives archaeologists a different perspective, and they can look at the wider landscape for clues.
Before we conducted any excavation here, we carried out different forms of archaeological survey, and they allow us to get a sense of what types of archaeology might be beneath the surface that we can't see on the surface at all. And without going into too much detail, what they suggested was that there was a very, very large possible, probable archaeological feature running through the middle of this field here, right next to the main monastic complex. And we started excavating here in order to test what we call a geophysical anomaly, something which is showing up on the geophysics. And that anomaly turned out to be the large enclosure ditch, which is curving around the monastic complex and which our trench is on top of, just behind me here. We're in our main excavation trench, and it doesn't look like much at the moment because this is the last time we excavated here was over a year ago. And at the end of each year we put a little bit of the mud that we've dug out of the trench back in to protect the trench as a whole. But hopefully you can see we're in a kind of rectangle. It's in this excavation here that we found loads and loads of material, which is really important to understanding the story of Glendalough. And some of that is lovely artifacts, some of which is in the display in the museum now. So there's the little jet stone cross, high status Viking jewellery and pins for holding clothes together. And that stuff's fantastic to find. But there's lots of stuff that we'd never be able to recover by excavation by hand. So we take samples of the soil, and that means we take a bag full or a bucket full of the soil and we take it back to the labs in UCD.
Today, everything from the archaeology excavations is kept and analysed. So while we are looking for interesting objects buried in the ground, we might also find clues in the earth around them. From small grains and pollens to soil, these tiny particles can also contain hidden treasures of information.
What we're looking at here is material that we've recovered from the excavations at Glendalough. So these are little burnt pieces of wood and nutshell and seeds, little organic pieces of plants that have survived for hundreds of years in the soil at Glendalough. They're very difficult to see. You can see here they're very small. I've magnified them by about 15 or 20 times here just to try and see them properly. In my research, I really want to find out what people were eating. So what I'm looking for are food remains, things like cereal grains and fruit seeds. And every so often you're looking through the dish in the microscope and there's lots and lots of wood, and then suddenly you see it, a little wheat grain. And it's very exciting to see that and think this is part of someone's dinner from 1,000 years ago. And I'm the first person in 1,000 years to see that. And it's a part of my job I really enjoy. People are often surprised that you find these tiny fragmentary remains of plants that have survived for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. And what you need are special conditions for them to become preserved. So if you imagine if you eat some cereals or you eat an apple and chuck it away, it'll decompose quite quickly, maybe over the space of a few weeks or months, and you won't find much of a trace of it. But if it becomes incorporated into certain conditions, it can survive for hundreds or thousands of years. And what we're relying on here is people burning things in the past. So this might have been people cooking their food and some of it dropped into the fire. There's lots of different ways that material can become charred and become preserved. So I can see here that we've got pieces of charcoal, charred wood, that might have been used as fuel on the fire. And we've even got some cereal grains. That's a little wheat grain we can see on the right-hand side there. And that's something that people were eating at Glendalough hundreds of years ago. And here it is, dug up by archaeologists, and we can recover it and examine it and study it under the microscope. So what we see very clearly at Glendalough are the early medieval communities were eating oats and barley, in particular, in terms of the cereal grains. And then in the later medieval period, a few hundred years later, we see a shift towards wheat. People are still eating oat and barley, but wheat has become much more common during this period. And that's what we see is people making different food choices through time.
When not on exhibition, the objects are carefully archived in the museum stores, which house millions of objects.
So as technology improves, we continue to find new ways to unlock information that's hidden in these objects. As that means if they're safe in the stores, future generations of archaeologists and researchers can analyse the objects and discover new information about the past.
But sometimes we can't preserve these artefacts as they're exposed to the weather and slowly erode and disappear over time. Like the sculpture over the door of the priest's house in Glendalough, which has now nearly totally disappeared. In the past, This was preserved by taking a plaster cast or making a drawing. But here again, we turn to new technology for help.
This is a three-dimensional laser scanner which we're going to use today to scan the priest house at Glendalough. 3D scanning is a very high precision, high resolution survey technique that allows us to create very, very high resolution 3D models. On the stones, each stone will have a point in space every 5 millimeters, so the overall survey will result in millions of points in space defining the 3D shape of the structure. So the 3D scans have to be done a number of times where I can only scan what we see. So at the moment I'm seeing the one facade of the building, but in order to join the different scans together, I've set out a framework of reference points, which I can then take the scanner and move it to the other side of the building, scan that facade and also include the spheres in the scan, and in that way piece things together. So you can see here that we've scanned all the exterior and gone into the interior. It's all joined together and it gives us this amazing three-dimensional model of the structure. We have enough detail there that we can then assess over time, if we do repeat surveys, whether the building's stable, whether there's erosion taking place, or whether there may even simply be damage or weathering. But within the structure and on the structure there's some very highly decorative pieces of stonework. And for these, the technique that we need to use might rely on a different scanner again to go to a higher resolution if we want to record those in the highest detail possible. And this is somewhat replicating what was done in the past using plaster casts, as we find with the lintel of the doorway.
The advantage of the laser scanning over the original plaster casts is that they preserve them in much finer detail. The models that they are able to create are in much finer detail. You can do things like alter the light that's shining on them, the artificial light created by the computer, and show details which couldn't be seen even when the scan was being carried out.
For all these new technologies, scannings and drones, sometimes the most effective way of finding out about an object is to try and recreate it using the old traditional methods. And here the experimental archaeologists at UCD have been recreating early Christian handbells like the ones that we saw earlier.
We're melting metal to cast it. So casting means to pour metal from a crucible, a little vessel that you melt the metal in, into a mould. And this is the type of process that would have been used in early medieval Ireland. So this is what we find archaeologically. A crucible is a clay pot, and you get this glassy outside. So that's what tells us it's a crucible. And it can have residues on the inside of it then from the metal. You see like this piece here? On site at Glendalough, we have these lovely brazed bells, these iron bells that would have been beaten out, forged from iron. Very complicated kind of process where you've got to fold the metal and then covered in this lovely coating of bronze, very thin surrounding of it. So I know that my crucible starts to glow at about 800 degrees. My metal will start to glow shortly after that, and then it will start to change colour and shimmer in front of me. These are all kind of indicators, and I'm sure many more, that people in the past would have used. When we find charcoal on a site, it's a really good indicator that we have an industrial process, a kind of a high heat process. You would use wood to cook and to do a lot of your domestic things, but where we find charcoal, which is a deliberately made thing, then we know that it's to reach high temperatures to do hot stuff. So after you've cast the metal into the mould, then you can break it in half, take off the top, and then you have your object inside. In this case, it's a small penannular brooch. In one hand, what we have at the end of that is a lot of ideas about what went on the site. And experimental archaeologists can use their understanding of materials and technologies as a kind of as a way to test them ideas. And it's important that we understand that, because that can tell us things about how much time and effort went into something, about the different connections between different places with technology moving from one to the other maybe, or the influence of somewhere like Glendalough that would have been a big epicenter for craft and production, and how that influenced its surrounding area. So that's in part what experimental archaeology can bring to our understanding. That's not what should happen.
The archaeologists have shown us the very many different ways that we can find out information about the past by looking at the buildings or the monuments, the landscape and the objects themselves.
Yeah, exactly, and the National Museum is keeping these objects in safe storage, and they still have many of their secrets left to reveal.
And it's really important, I suppose, that those objects are kept safe, because our understanding of history is changing. How we interpret the evidence, we might put the clues together slightly differently.
Exactly, and constantly new scientific techniques are coming to the fore, and maybe the next generation of scientists, archaeologists and researchers will unlock further secrets about the archaeology of Glendalough through its objects.